What I want to do now is I want to turn our attention to two things. We've got 20 minutes, and I want to read from Nick's paper because I think it's very important, and I want to put up an appropriate image, and I'm trying to think what image I should put up. I need to tell you a little bit about how this came about, all right? For several years now, I have known that there was something very, very strange in the background of JPL, all right? And that strangeness is an individual named Aleister Crowley. What is not generally known is that Aleister Crowley was very closely connected with the engineer and genius founder of what would eventually become known as the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. So let me read, and I have never read one of these things, a paper that Nick and I are going to put on the web in the next few days called JPL, Parsons, and the Crowley Connection. This subject is very, very esoteric. Not that the rest of the evening has been run-of-the-mill. It deals with the history of our own government and some of the very institutions responsible for sending robots out now between the planets. Institutions rich in traditions and even outright symbolism. But of what nature? On what used to be a desolate spot in the Arroyo Seco, north of Pasadena, lies a 165-acre complex called JPL, or the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. And give me a pause here, and in fact I can show you a picture. Jack Parsons, a brilliant young Caltech chemist and founder of JPL, forever changed the course of rocketry by adding with a brilliant flash of insight the chemical potassium perchlorate to the then standard black powder solid rocket ignition systems being employed at the time, in the mid-1930s. His long-range hope was similar to another rocket pioneer, Robert Goddard's, in this same period. He wished to develop a more powerful means of eventually exploring space beyond our planet. But official government funding of such impractical dreams in the 30s was essentially non-existent. With the advent of the Second World War, all that changed. Only the sudden infusion of dizzying new funding into this new science was not for scientific exploration. It was for rocketry's more obvious military applications. Through Jack Parsons, JPL thus developed an early institutional expertise in solid rocket propulsion and instrumentation. In parallel in this period to Robert Goddard's individual separate Roswell, New Mexico efforts at liquid fuel experimentation, also carried out in these mid-1930s to 1940s. But in 1957, after the shock of the first Soviet satellite named Sputnik and a highly visible but explosive failure by a U.S. Navy response, JPL was ultimately chosen by the Army to attempt to salvage American national pride through the launch of a JPL artificial satellite. The successful orbiting of JPL's Explorer-1, whose primary discovery would be the existence of the so-called Van Allen radiation belts encircling the planet, marked the beginning of the American space age, January 31, 1958. It also marked the ascendancy of JPL as the nation's most visible premier space center. As stated, originally under Army jurisdiction, President Eisenhower, concerned about JPL in the hands of the growing Cold War military-industrial complex, had JPL transferred to the civilian sector under a NASA Caltech contract in 1959, where it was given its eventual mandate, if not virtual monopoly, among NASA's many other centers, to explore deep space. JPL, again, just up the street, led the U.S. unmanned missions to the moon with the Ranger and Surveyor projects in the 1960s, to Mercury, Venus, and Mars with Mariners 2 through 10, to Mars with Vikings 1 and 2, and to Jupiter and Saturn and beyond with the equally historic Voyagers. JPL also conducted tracking and communications through the DSN, the Deep Space Network, for Pioneers 10 and 11, and has recently carried out Galileo projects which not only re-imaged and carried out experiments to study Jupiter's atmosphere, but have sent the spacecraft to re-image Europa, one of Jupiter's so-called Galilean moons, now known to have volcanic activity, oceans, and enough internal heat to have possibly spawned life forms that, if they exist, should have evolved and remained undisturbed for 5 billion years. And many of you know that I wrote about that about 20 years ago, which NASA is very conveniently forgetting. As also stated earlier, John Whitesides Parsons, chemist and rocket engineer extraordinaire, was the actual creator of the Caltech lab eventually called JPL, or, among insiders, Jack Parsons Lab. And while there is very little official biographical information to be found on him in the general literature, it is a curious fact that most of his papers and books are still classified by the Department of Defense. One thing that is known, at least within the planetary science community, is that Parsons has been officially immortalized by the International Astronomical Union by having a crater named for him on the moon. It is therefore extremely puzzling that the rest of Parsons' life, in comparison to far more obscure space scientists and engineers, is relatively unknown, even among avid JPL enthusiasts. Perhaps the reason for this paucity of information has something, perhaps a lot, to do with certain aspects of Parsons' private life that most at NASA and JPL, actually in the know, might rather be forgotten. Because one striking aspect of Parsons' private life that has been well documented outside of official governmental sources and publications is his curious association with an individual known as Aleister Crowley. Given Crowley's overwhelming and intensely controversial interests, the demonstrable importance of Crowley in Jack Parsons' private and professional life, stay tuned, and an inexplicable Crowleyan pattern that has recently emerged in all JPL missions, one feels compelled to ask at this late date, who was Aleister Crowley? And what was his heretofore unseen but apparently highly influential role in the founding and evolution of this critical national space facility called JPL? Aleister Crowley was the premier self-styled Western magician of the 20th century, who some have called the most evil man in the world. Crowley simply termed himself the Great Beast. He wouldn't invite him to dinner. Whose secret name in his order was Phoenix, for reasons that will later become apparent. Parsons became one of Crowley's greatest students and was said to have been his personally chosen successor. Let me repeat that. We have documentation, no question, that Parsons was selected by Crowley to be his successor in these arcane, magical rituals and ceremonies and practices. This is not something you're going to get from a NASA press release, all right? Parsons quickly moved up the ranks of Crowley's organization called the Order of the Eastern Temple and was eventually appointed head of the lodge in Pasadena by Crowley himself. Parsons swore an oath of allegiance to guide humanity into, quote, an age of communion with the gods. Is this something you're going to read in NASA's official stuff? Using his demonstrable vast talents of insight and science and, in his own words, magic. The objectives of those like Crowley who practice Western magic is ostensibly, quote, to advance humanity by contact with higher intelligence. That is, read with extraterrestrials. Gosh, is that what they're up to? Either by calling them down or traveling to their planets, which, if the objects on STS-48 and STS-80 are what they now appear to be, we almost certainly can. These are things you've seen on the UN briefing, and you're going to see before Christmas on our analysis of the shuttle video that was downlinked live by NASA in December of last year.